Arizona was once a Confederate territory during the American Civil War. It's a little-known chapter of history, but one man stood at the center of it all, John Robert Baylor. He proclaimed the Confederate Territory of Arizona on August 1, 1861, and served as its only governor. Born on July 27, 1822, in Paris, Kentucky, John Robert Baylor's roots were steeped in frontier history. His father, Dr. John Walker Baylor, was a U.S. Army surgeon who served in the Black Hawk War before being stationed at Fort Gibson in Indian Territory. Baylor's early life set the stage for a journey marked by adventure, conflict, and political ambition. In 1833, the Baylor family moved to Second Creek near Natchez, Mississippi, where young John spent his formative years. Tragically, in 1836, while John and his brother Henry were attending school in Cincinnati, their father passed away. By 1837, the family relocated to Little Rock, Arkansas, where his widowed mother ran a boarding house. But John's heart wasn't in Arkansas. The Texas frontier was calling. At 18, John and his brother Henry moved to Texas, settling on their uncle's farm near LaGrange. It was here in 1840 that John had a life-changing experience. He and his brother joined a pursuit of Comanche warriors, taking part in skirmishes that left a lasting mark on him. These events shaped John's views on Native Americans, fostering a deep-seated animosity that would later define his political and military career. By 1842, John and Henry Baylor joined Captain Nicholas Mosby Dawson's Texas cavalry during the Battle of Salado. A sudden flood separated them from their unit, a twist of fate that likely saved their lives as most of Dawson's men were killed in the battle. This near-death experience may have pushed John to seek a change. Baylor reunited with his family in Indian Territory, where his mother operated a boarding house for Army officers. Through family connections, he secured a position as a teacher at a Creek Indian school. For a year, John educated as many as 35 students, a brief period of relative peace before turmoil struck again. In July 1844, John witnessed a fatal altercation involving his brother-in-law, Captain James Dawson. Though John wasn't directly involved, both he and Dawson were arrested for the killing. They managed to escape custody, fleeing back to Texas to avoid prosecution. Back in Texas, John settled in Marshall, where he met and married Emily Hanna in 1845. The couple soon moved to Fayette County, where John prospered as a farmer. By 1850, his real estate holdings were valued at $5,500, a substantial sum for the time. Together, he and Emily raised 3 sons and built a life of stability and prominence. Baylor's growing reputation in the community led to his election to the 5th Texas Legislature in 1853, representing Fayette County. Around this time, he also pursued a career in law, earning admission to the district court in 1854. John R. Baylor's conflicts with the Comanche Indians soon escalated into personal disputes, further hardening his already harsh views toward Native Americans. By July 1855, he was appointed as special agent, overseeing the Comanches at the Brazos Agency. Relocating his family to the agency, Baylor purchased a ranch on the Clear Fork of the Brazos in Parker County. Despite the agency's mission to maintain peace, Baylor observed the Comanches continuing their raids across Texas. Enraged by what he perceived as betrayal, he began advocating for severe punitive measures against them. This stance ultimately led to his removal as special agent on May 18, 1857. Even after his dismissal, Baylor's frustration grew as Comanche raids persisted without significant government intervention. On May 23, 1859, he took matters into his own hands, rallying a vigilante force of 250 to 350 Texas frontiersmen. Baylor and his group marched to the Brazos Agency with the intent of driving out the Comanches. A violent skirmish unfolded near the reservation, resulting in casualties on both sides. The defeated Comanches retreated to the reservation, pursued by Baylor's men. Although United States Army troops stationed at the reservation, under the command of Major George H. Thomas, later a famed Union general, stood by without intervening, Major Thomas eventually negotiated with Baylor. Thomas assured Baylor that the Comanches would be relocated to Indian Territory, and Baylor agreed to withdraw his men. Shortly thereafter, the Brazos Agency was shut down, and the Comanches were moved to Oklahoma. However, their raids from across the border continued, prompting Baylor to lead additional expeditions against them in 1859 and 1860. By 1860, John R. Baylor was living in Weatherford, Texas, with his wife and 7 children. Despite identifying himself as a lawyer on the census, he was actively engaged in ranching, with his property valued at $2,000 in personal assets, including 7 slaves, estimated at $10,700. Notably, Baylor's younger brother, George Wythe Baylor, was also residing with him and listed his occupation as Indian killer to the census taker. As the nation hurtled toward civil war after Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, Baylor traveled with his brother to visit their mother in San Antonio. On their return journey, they stopped in Austin, where they signed a petition on December 8, 1860, calling for a convention to discuss Texas's potential secession from the Union. The petition proved successful, and Baylor was subsequently elected as a delegate to the Texas Secession Convention. A staunch supporter of secession, he participated in the February 1, 1861 vote that passed the Ordinance of Secession. Later that month, the people of Texas ratified the convention's decision, formally withdrawing the state from the Union. One pressing concern for the secessionists was the presence of thousands of U.S. troops stationed across Texas. Baylor, anticipating potential resistance, issued a call for 1,000 volunteers under the guise of organizing a buffalo hunt on the plains. In reality, he was assembling a regiment of mounted rifles to counter any opposition from federal forces. As events unfolded, these preparations became unnecessary when General David Twiggs, the Union commander in Texas and a proponent of states' rights, peacefully surrendered U.S. military installations and property to Texas authorities on February 15, 1861. Twiggs famously remarked, "If an old woman with a broomstick should come with full authority from the state of Texas to demand the public property, I would give it up to her." Undeterred, Baylor continued recruiting for his regiment, which became fully operational by March 19, 1861. Known as the 2nd Regiment of Texas Mounted Rifles, the unit was officially accepted into Confederate service on May 23, 1861. Baylor was appointed lieutenant colonel and given command of 1 battalion, while the other was led by Colonel John S. "Rip" Ford. While Ford's battalion was dispatched to the Brownsville area, Baylor's troops were tasked with occupying the now-abandoned federal forts in far west Texas, a mission that would unexpectedly elevate Baylor to political prominence. The journey across the arid plains of West Texas to Fort Bliss was grueling. Baylor's battalion, which initially numbered about 700 men, was reduced to fewer than 400 due to desertion and the need to garrison forts along the way. Baylor himself did not reach Fort Bliss until July 13, 1861. Upon arrival, he faced troubling reports of Union forces amassing at Fort Fillmore near Mesilla, posing a potential threat to Confederate-held Fort Bliss. Major Isaac Lind, commanding over 700 troops at Fort Fillmore, had received reinforcements from other posts in western Arizona, which were being evacuated under orders from Colonel Edward Canby. Baylor also recognized the growing pro-Confederate sentiment in Arizona, a region south of the Gila River. In March 1861, conventions held in Mesilla and Tucson had voted to secede from the Union and petitioned for Confederate annexation. These developments set the stage for Baylor's rise to governorship in what would soon become the Confederate Territory of Arizona. Armed with strategic insight, John R. Baylor made a decisive move to carve out a Confederate stronghold in Arizona. With a small force of 250 men, he launched an ambitious campaign to support pro-Confederate elements in the region. On July 23, he departed Fort Bliss, leaving a garrison behind, and crossed the Rio Grande at San Tomas. By the next day, Baylor's force had encamped within striking distance of Fort Fillmore. However, instead of launching a direct attack, he recrossed the river and established his position in Mesilla, setting the stage for confrontation. Major Isaac Lind, commander of the Union forces at Fort Fillmore, responded swiftly upon learning of Baylor's presence. Leading his entire garrison, Lind crossed the river to confront the Confederates and demanded their surrender. Baylor refused. Union artillery opened fire but failed to inflict damage on Baylor's men, instead wounding townsfolk who had gathered to watch. As Union cavalry prepared to charge, they rode straight into an ambush. A hidden Confederate company unleashed enfilade fire, killing 3 and wounding several others. The sudden attack sent the Union cavalry into disarray, trampling their own infantry in retreat. Major Lind withdrew his forces to Fort Fillmore, leaving Baylor victorious. Expecting a counterattack, Baylor fortified Mesilla the following day. To his surprise, Fort Fillmore was soon engulfed in smoke as Lind abandoned the post and began a grueling retreat to Fort Stanton, 154 miles northeast. Acting quickly, Baylor devised a plan to intercept the Union troops. Scouts informed him of a critical pass near San Augustine Springs, the only nearby water source for Lind's men. Baylor pushed his forces on a forced march, capturing Union stragglers along the way, many of whom were intoxicated after raiding whiskey stores at Fort Fillmore. On July 27th, Baylor's men reached the pass and set up a defensive line, cutting off Lind's route. Exhausted and parched after their arduous journey, the Union troops arrived to find their path blocked. Despite outnumbering Baylor's force, they were in no condition to fight. Faced with no alternative, Major Lind surrendered his command. With this victory, John R. Baylor not only captured a significant Union force, but also solidified his control over the southern New Mexico Territory, marking a pivotal moment in the Confederacy's campaign in the Southwest. Back in Mesilla, Baylor swiftly implemented the next phase of his ambitious plan. On August 1st, he issued a bold declaration titled, "Proclamation to the People of the Territory of Arizona." The proclamation began with a striking acknowledgement of the chaos in the region. Since Arizona's social and political situation is on the verge of total chaos, and its citizens are essentially without protection, law, and order, the territory is hereby temporarily constituted as a military government, effective from this date until Congress provides otherwise. In the name and on behalf of the Confederate States of America, I, John R. Baylor, Lieutenant Colonel, commanding the Confederate Army in the Territory of Arizona, officially assume possession of said territory. This proclamation officially established the Confederate Territory of Arizona, encompassing all of New Mexico Territory south of the 34th parallel of north latitude. Baylor laid out the structure of the new government, naming Mesilla as the capital and designating Mesilla and Tucson as locations for district and probate courts. The existing laws of the U.S. Territory of New Mexico would remain in effect unless they conflicted with Confederate law or its constitution. Baylor also announced his intention to appoint key territorial officers to oversee the new administration. The very next day, August 2, 1861, Baylor began assigning officials to their posts. He named himself territorial governor, while James A. Lucas of Mesilla was appointed secretary of the territory. Marcus H. McWillie was named Attorney General, E. Augerstein was selected as treasurer, and George M. Frazier of Mesilla, who also commanded the Arizona Rangers, was designated territorial marshal. By the end of the month, every position in the territorial government had been filled, ensuring the machinery of Confederate governance was fully operational. Remarkably, Baylor's efforts bore immediate fruit. The district and probate courts, central to the new government, were functioning within days of their creation. Records from the First District Probate Court in Mesilla reveal its proceedings began on August 8, 1861, just a week after Baylor's proclamation. This efficiency underscored Baylor's organizational capabilities and his commitment to establishing order in the Confederate Territory of Arizona. Under Baylor's leadership, the Confederate government in Arizona operated smoothly for nearly a year, maintaining its authority and functionality until Union forces reclaimed the territory in July 1862. Baylor's efforts left an enduring impression, highlighting his ability to forge a functioning administration under challenging circumstances. It soon became clear that Arizonans were very much in favor of Baylor creating the Confederate Territory of Arizona. A convention of the people of Arizona was held in Tucson on August 28, 1861. This convention formally ratified Baylor's actions from earlier that month and moved to elect a delegate to represent the territory in the Confederate States Congress. Granville Henderson Urey, a prominent figure from Tucson, was chosen for the role, a position he had also been elected to in earlier conventions held in April 1860 and March 1861. Governor Baylor accepted the outcomes of the convention, including Ory's nomination as territorial delegate. Ory started traveling to Richmond shortly afterward in order to take his place in the Confederate Congress. Upon taking office as governor, Baylor faced an extraordinarily challenging military situation. With just 450 troops, 250 stationed in La Mesilla and another 200 at Fort Bliss, he was tasked with defending the vast Confederate territory of Arizona. One of his initial acts as governor had been to muster all local militia companies into Confederate service, which brought his total force to roughly 650 men. However, this modest number was stretched thin across a territory plagued by multiple threats. These included a looming Union invasion led by Colonel Edward R. S. Canby, who commanded approximately 2,000 troops stationed at Fort Craig, just 100 miles north of La Mesilla. Adding to the turmoil were persistent raids by Mexican bandits from Sonora and the ever-present danger of Apache attacks. Baylor's frustration over his limited resources was evident in a letter dated September 24, 1861, in which he urged his superiors for reinforcements. "I would again urge the necessity of forwarding with haste reinforcements. The Sonora Mexicans have looted Tubac and are threatening to rob Tucson, and the Indians are a major nuisance. As I have previously said, I am unable to provide any security to the citizens and control the adversary, the Yankees, with the small army I command. Although I believe that Union forces are en route to this territory from California, I will make every effort to maintain the territory in spite of all obstacles." Despite his pleas, reinforcements were not immediately sent, leaving Baylor and his men to rely on their ingenuity and limited resources. Against these odds, Baylor managed to maintain a degree of control over the territory. To monitor Union forces, Baylor dispatched Confederate patrols along the Rio Grande to observe Fort Craig. These patrols occasionally clashed with Union scouts gathering intelligence on Confederate positions. One significant encounter occurred on September 27, 1861, when a Union reconnaissance force of nearly 200 cavalrymen, led by Captain R. M. Morris, advanced south toward Mesilla. At Canada Alamosa, about 40 miles south of Fort Craig, this Union force was intercepted and driven back by roughly 100 Confederate troops under Captain Bethel Coopwood. This and other smaller skirmishes along the border served a critical purpose. They prevented the Union from gaining a clear understanding of the Confederate forces' limited strength and deterred Colonel Canby, the Union commander, from launching a large-scale offensive into Confederate-held Arizona. Baylor's ability to outmaneuver and mislead Union forces, despite his constrained resources, was a testament to his strategic acumen and determination to defend the territory under his command. The challenges facing the new Confederate territory of Arizona extended far beyond the threat of Union forces, with the relentless Apache raids proving far more difficult to control. Upon Governor Baylor's arrival in Arizona, he encountered a crisis of devastating proportions. Emboldened and unrelenting, the Apaches had begun what one modern report called a saturnalia of carnage so intense that it appeared the final vestige of civilization was going to be extinguished in blood. The abrupt evacuation of U.S. Army forces from the area in May 1861, when the Civil War broke out, was the cause of this grave scenario. The Apaches, unaware of the war raging to the east, perceived the Army's retreat as a victory of their own making. Believing they had driven the soldiers out, they turned their focus toward a campaign of extermination aimed at permanently expelling the white settlers from their ancestral lands. Wagon trains were ambushed and their occupants massacred. Mines and ranches were raided and burned to the ground. Even larger settlements like Tubac, Tucson, and Pinos Altos were either under attack or lived under the constant threat of Apache raids. Panic swept through the territory, leaving its residents in a state of chaos. Desperate for protection, they turned to Baylor and the Confederate Army as their only hope for salvation. Unfortunately for the settlers, most of Baylor's limited forces were tied up keeping Union troops in check, leaving only a small number of men available to deal with the Apaches. The responsibility for confronting these attacks fell largely to local militia groups recently mustered into Confederate service. Among these units, the Arizona Guards of Pinos Altos stood out for their bravery and effectiveness, engaging the Apache in several hard-fought battles between August 1861 and February 1862. While these militias displayed remarkable courage and determination, their numbers were too few to cover the vast territory. The Apache raids continued unabated, spreading fear and destruction across the region. Baylor's administration faced an overwhelming challenge, with the Apaches proving to be a formidable and relentless foe, one that the fledgling Confederate Territory struggled to contain. One of Baylor's key responses to the Apache threat was his authorization to create a regiment of Arizona Rangers. Modeled after the famed Texas Rangers, a force with which Baylor was well acquainted, this regiment was tasked with frontier peacekeeping and combating the ongoing Apache resistance in Confederate Arizona. Recruitment efforts began in December 1861, led by Sherrod Hunter, then a first lieutenant in Captain George Frazier's militia company of Arizona Rangers, based in Mesilla. Upon receiving his commission as captain, Hunter was charged with raising the first company for this regiment. Despite ambitious plans to assemble 6 companies, only Captain Sherrod Hunter's Company A was successfully formed. Officially mustered into service on January 25, 1862, this unit would soon face a very different enemy than the Apaches, the Union's advancing California column. The Arizona Rangers would see their first significant action in the spring of 1862, defending Confederate Arizona from Union forces rather than combating the Apache as initially intended. Throughout late 1861, Baylor inundated Confederate leaders in Richmond with urgent letters outlining his dire circumstances. His situation was precarious. He had neither the manpower to subdue the Apaches nor the resources to fend off a full-scale invasion by Union forces amassing at Fort Craig. Fully aware of the odds stacked against him, Baylor began preparations to abandon Mesilla and retreat into West Texas. This decision sparked outrage among certain segments of the local population, particularly those with more aggressive stances on the defense of Confederate Arizona. Leading the opposition was Robert P. Kelly, editor of the Mesilla Times, Arizona's most prominent newspaper. Upon learning of Baylor's plan, Kelly unleashed scathing criticisms of the governor through his editorial columns, accusing Baylor of cowardice and claiming his decision was driven more by fear than by military necessity. Baylor initially chose to ignore Kelly's attacks, hoping to avoid public controversy. However, on December 12, 1861, Kelly published a particularly inflammatory editorial, accusing Baylor of abandoning Mesilla and tarnishing his reputation further. Baylor's restraint finally gave way, particularly as some of his men and officers began urging him to respond to Kelly's accusations. In a dramatic turn of events, Baylor confronted Kelly at Bull's store, demanding he cease his attacks. Misinterpreting Baylor's earlier patience as weakness, Kelly not only refused, but escalated the situation by hurling further insults and drawing a large Bowie knife. Baylor, in response, grabbed a rifle leaning against the wall and struck Kelly over the head, knocking him to the ground. As the scuffle continued, Baylor seized Kelly's wrist to prevent him from using the knife. However, Baylor, still recovering from illness, found himself growing weaker as Kelly grew more desperate. Baylor warned Kelly to drop the weapon or face deadly consequences, but Kelly refused, doubling his efforts to wield the blade. Left with no other option, Baylor drew his revolver with his free hand and fired, striking Kelly in the jaw and neck. The knife flew from Kelly's grasp, but the injuries proved fatal. He succumbed to his wounds a few days later. This violent incident not only quelled Kelly's criticisms, but also underscored the volatile tensions within Confederate Arizona, a region already grappling with relentless external threats and internal strife. Not long after, new developments forced Governor Baylor to abandon his retreat from Arizona. On January 11, 1862, Brigadier General Henry Hopkins Sibley arrived in Mesilla with 3 regiments of Texas cavalry, grandly dubbed the Army of New Mexico. This marked a pivotal moment for Baylor, signaling that his urgent pleas had finally reached Confederate leaders. However, it soon became clear that Sibley had not come in response to Baylor's calls for reinforcements, but rather had his own agenda in mind. It was evident that Sibley was prepared to undermine Baylor's command if it meant advancing his own plans. Sibley's strategy was focused on an offensive against the Union forces stationed at Fort Craig. Following this, he intended to lead his Confederate troops northward, capturing Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and the crucial post at Fort Union along the way. However, rather than bolstering Baylor's defensive efforts for the Confederate Territory of Arizona, Sibley sought to weaken them. He ordered Baylor to relinquish over half of his force, specifically a battalion of mounted rifles under Major Charles Pyron, to join his advancing army. For Baylor, this transfer meant that Sibley's army would now take the lead in confronting the Union threat, allowing him to concentrate his remaining forces on addressing the Apache menace. With fewer resources at his disposal, Baylor was faced with the daunting task of pacifying these relentless raiders. Although this redistribution of forces allowed Baylor to take a more active role in dealing with the Apache threat, his frustration grew as he found himself constantly chasing after elusive raiders with little success. During one of these relentless pursuits, Baylor resorted to a tactic that would later cost him his governorship. In January 1862, a group of Chiricahua Apaches had driven off 100 horses belonging to the Confederate Army, leading them into Mexico. Governor Baylor acted at once, directing a sizable force to pursue it south. He eventually arrived at the hamlet of Corralitos, which is roughly 100 miles south of the international border, after the pursuit took him far into the Mexican state of Chihuahua. 9 Apaches, 3 women, 5 children, and 1 man were apprehended by Baylor there. Determined to recoup the stolen stock, Baylor saw little other option but to take a hard stance against the captured Apaches. He declared that it was justifiable to kill the adults and recover the stolen animals. Executing the 2 adults, Baylor took the remaining children as prisoners, a decision that not only highlighted his desperation in dealing with the Apache threat, but also ignited controversy that would later lead to his political downfall. Governor Baylor recognized that military force alone was not enough to address the persistent problem of the Apaches. Determined to adopt a more comprehensive approach, he decided to utilize other means alongside his troops. Baylor first sent Captain Sherrod Hunter into western Arizona with orders to negotiate treaties with the Pima and Papago Indians, longtime enemies of the Apache. On February 28, 1862, Hunter and his command arrived in Tucson. It's believed that Hunter's presence may have deterred a major Apache attack on the town, although this cannot be confirmed with certainty. Regardless, Hunter promptly sent his men out on patrols to pacify the surrounding area, which temporarily made Tucson safe from the threat of Indian raids. Captain Hunter continued to the Pima settlements along the Gila River, close to present-day Zacatón on March 3rd. There, he met with Chief Antonio Azul and made a treaty for mutual defense against the Apaches, a critical step in pacifying the region. While the treaty held promise, it ultimately proved futile as the Confederate Territory of Arizona soon collapsed. Baylor's venture into diplomacy did not yield the intended results, and the collapse of Confederate control rendered the agreement meaningless. As the Apache danger increased, Governor Baylor became more and more frantic to find a solution. On March 20, 1862, he issued a directive that would go down in history as one of the most ruthless policies of the Confederate Territory of Arizona. Baylor ordered Confederate commanders to use all means necessary to persuade the Apaches or any tribe to come in for peace talks. Once gathered, they were to kill all the grown Indians and take any children prisoner, selling them to fund the extermination of the adults. He authorized the purchase of whiskey and goods to pacify the tribes, instructing his subordinates to leave no stone unturned to ensure success. No Indian should be allowed to escape. It's unclear whether Baylor's subordinates ever carried out these orders, as no records confirm such actions, but the directive itself highlighted the lengths to which Baylor was willing to go to deal with the Apache menace. The news of a disaster suffered by General Sibley's forces at the Battle of Glorieta Pass marked a turning point for Baylor's administration. Sibley's Army of New Mexico had initially aimed to invade and conquer the Union-controlled parts of the old U.S. territory of New Mexico. After a significant victory at Valverde in February 1862, Sibley moved north, capturing Albuquerque and Santa Fe and preparing for the final assault on Fort Union. However, on March 28, 1862, the Army of New Mexico met a strong Union force at Glorieta Pass, a few miles west of Fort Union. Although the Confederates achieved a tactical victory on the battlefield, they suffered a major strategic defeat when a small Union force outflanked them, destroying the Confederate supply train. This loss rendered Sibley's campaign unsustainable, forcing the Confederates to retreat back to Mesilla. The rapid progression of events following the Confederate disaster at Glorieta Pass was catastrophic for Baylor and his forces. Upon receiving word of the Union invasion from California, Captain Sherrod Hunter stationed at Tucson provided crucial intelligence. He informed Baylor that the Union California Column, a brigade of approximately 2,300 infantry and cavalry, had crossed into Arizona and was threatening Baylor's western flank. Hunter's actions bought time for the Confederates in Arizona. He confiscated a significant store of grain accumulated for Union use at the Pima villages and defeated a Union scouting force at the Battle of Picacho Pass. However, it soon became apparent that these efforts were insufficient. The Confederates' position in Arizona was untenable, and the collapse of Baylor's administration seemed inevitable as the Union forces steadily closed in. When the pitiful remnants of Sibley's Army of New Mexico finally staggered back into Mesilla in late April 1862, it must have been clear to John Robert Baylor that the Confederacy's hold on the Southwest was nearing its end. Baylor had managed to maintain a presence in Mesilla through May and June of 1862, but by the end of that month, he was forced to retreat to San Antonio. The last Confederate troops left the Mesilla region in early July 1862, effectively marking the end of the Confederate Territory of Arizona. When the Confederacy abandoned the territory, it was not without controversy. Some Confederate leaders were quick to suggest that the conquest and defense of Arizona and New Mexico had been a waste of blood and resources. General Sibley, whose Confederate Army of New Mexico had faced disaster in Arizona, famously declared that he believed the territory was not worth a quarter of the blood and treasure expended to take and defend it. Many of his fellow leaders shared this sentiment. However, John Robert Baylor and a faction of ardent Arizona secessionists disagreed. They believed that Arizona could still be liberated from Union control and were determined to see it through. This ambition drove Baylor to start rallying people in favor of a fresh Confederate invasion of Arizona. On April 14, 1862, Confederate Secretary of War George W. Randolph authorized Baylor to recruit in the Arizona Territory. The directive allowed him to muster these volunteers into service either singly or by companies for a period of 3 years or for the duration of the war. The plan was to organize these forces into regiments and eventually form a brigade to defend the territory. After arriving in San Antonio in July 1862 as directed, Baylor promptly established his headquarters in Eagle Lake, Texas, which is well situated between San Antonio and Houston. Baylor immediately began to recruit and organize. His goal was ambitious, to raise a new Arizona brigade consisting of 5 battalions of mounted rifles, each with 500 men, totaling 2,000 troops. The recruitment effort went well, and by December 1862, Baylor had signed up 1,500 of his planned 2,000 men. However, equipping these troops was proving to be a major challenge. Only 3 companies, about 300 men, had been armed, and even then the weapons were poorly outfitted. Just as Baylor's plans for the recapture of Arizona were on the cusp of maturing, they were abruptly thwarted. The Confederate government in Richmond was informed of Baylor's March 1862 command to eradicate the Apache Indians. President Jefferson Davis was outraged upon learning of this and immediately took action. He cashiered Baylor from the army, deprived him of his military title, and removed him from his position as governor of Arizona. This sudden removal was not something Baylor took lying down. In keeping with his character, Baylor did not take this insult lightly. He corresponded with Major General John Bankhead Magruder, the Department of Texas commander, on December 29, 1862. Baylor delivered the message using an Apache shield he had stolen from a chief he had killed. The scalp of a woman, namely the blonde hair of a Miss Jackson, who had been killed during one of the regular attacks, was used to adorn this shield. According to George Wythe Baylor's post-war account, the shield was also adorned with the scalps of infants dressed in the manner of animal skins, painted with bright colors, and ornamented with beads. In his note, Baylor requested that this shield be sent to President Davis, hoping to show the president the reasons behind the bitter feelings shared by Baylor and the people of the frontier toward the Indians. Magruder's reaction to receiving this grisly trophy remains a mystery, but it's known that he did not pass it along to President Davis. Instead, he managed to convince Baylor to take back both his note and his gift. Although Baylor's Confederate career seemed to be over, it wasn't the end of his involvement in the conflict. Shortly after his removal from command of the Arizona Brigade, Baylor enlisted as a private in a Texas cavalry regiment that served in the Galveston Campaign in January 1863. Later that year, he ran for and won a seat in the Confederate Congress. In this role, he tirelessly lobbied for support to retake Arizona from the Union. Baylor's passion for the cause continued until the end of the war. By December 1864, Baylor's efforts began to pay off, albeit in a different way than he had envisioned. He proposed sending a force of 2,500 Texans to retake Arizona and New Mexico for the Confederacy. Up to 10,000 Confederate sympathizers may be enlisted in northern Mexico and Arizona to aid in this endeavor, according to Baylor. In an unexpected twist, considering his history of anti-Indian rhetoric and actions, Baylor even suggested that an alliance with the Plains Indians could be forged. He proposed that this alliance would disrupt the lines of communication between Missouri and the far west, isolating Union forces there and forcing them to deploy troops from Arizona to counter the Indian threat. Astonishingly, this bold proposal found favor, perhaps out of desperation, in the Confederate War Department. They forwarded the idea to President Davis, who surprisingly agreed to it. On March 25, 1865, John Robert Baylor was commissioned once more as an officer in the Confederate States Army, this time with the rank of colonel. He was authorized to recruit in the frontier counties of Texas and quickly set off for his new assignment. General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia were compelled to leave Richmond 8 days after he was commissioned. 7 days later, they surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. By the time Baylor reached Shreveport, Louisiana on May 14th, he found the Army of the Trans-Mississippi in the throes of disintegration. As he moved further into Texas, Baylor encountered mass desertion among the soldiers. The Confederacy was clearly in its final days, dead though not yet buried. It was only a matter of time before its collapse was complete. When Baylor reached Huntsville, he saw a group of troops who were just beginning a brawl. They were threatening to storm the state prison, believing it held large stocks of clothing that had never been issued to the troops. Wearing a long linen duster and carrying a handgun with an ivory handle, Baylor attempted to appease the irate soldiers by complimenting their wartime service. When this didn't work, Baylor placed his hand on his revolver and shouted, "I'll be damned if you will rob your state. I will protect her property." For a moment, no one moved, and then the crowd slowly began to disperse. A few days later, General Edmund Kirby Smith surrendered the Confederate Army of the Trans-Mississippi, effectively bringing the war to an end. John R. Baylor originally made his home in San Antonio following the war, and then he moved to Montel in Uvalde County, Texas. There he worked as a rancher and continued his political career. His maverick behavior during the post-war years kept him in the news. A man named Gilchrist was stabbed in the heart by Baylor in the streets of Uvalde in 1881. This was the most notable of several gunfights and at least one knife battle that he was involved in. Local newspapers described Baylor as a man who did not seek out fights, but was always ready to defend himself when necessary. He died on February 8, 1894, and was buried at Montel, Texas. While some of his actions may seem extreme or brutal to us today, it's essential to remember the context of the times in which he lived. It was a place where survival often depended on being prepared to take the lives of others in defense of oneself and one's property. Baylor demonstrated that he was willing to take on this challenge on multiple occasions. However, his legacy is more than just his confrontational past. Thanks to his efforts, Arizona's dream of separate territorial status became a reality. It seems doubtful that the U.S. territory would have been created in 1863 if the Confederate Territory of Arizona had not been created. If it had, its borders would likely have been different. Indeed, it's quite possible that without Baylor's influence, today's Arizona might not even exist. For this reason, John Robert Baylor, Arizona's first and only active Confederate governor, should not be forgotten.